All right. So we have the tiniest ever little bit of content to get through for this last day of class before your exams. And then I have a couple notes and announcements for you about what we'll be doing on Friday and then during finals week. Okay. So our last little bit was just about these hormonal changes during pregnancy. So for the end of class last time, we talked a little bit more about estrogen and progesterone. We know some things about what they're doing during the typical menstrual cycle, but we tacked on that they have additional activities, additional effects in the case that fertilization occurs and proceeds into pregnancy. So we talked about how estrogen is stimulating the growth of ducts in the breasts, stimulating prolactin. Eventually, we're preparing these breasts to produce milk to feed a growing baby. And we know that estrogen is also making the uterus more responsive to the effects of oxytocin, which is important because this is going to be creating contractions during parturition, so during the birth process. Progesterone is working on other parts of the breast. So we have both ducts for milk and we have glands for milk. So progesterone is working to produce those glands, make them grow larger, make them actually able to lactate. And we're keeping the uterine conditions in this kind of secretory phase. We talked about how during the second half of the menstrual cycle, during that portion of time when the ovaries are in the luteal phase, we have this kind of preparation in the uterus for implantation. We know we're producing glycogen-rich fluid to feed a growing embryo at first. We know that we're increasing vasculature. We know that we're producing cervical mucus that can kind of plug up the cervix to prevent pathogens from coming in. So progesterone is still working to do that during pregnancy. Because the uterus, because estrogen is making these changes on the uterus, making it more likely easier to contract, it's also important that progesterone is suppressing the actual impulse to contract in the uterus, because we don't want that to happen until we're actually ready to give birth. So on this graph, you also see another hormone, HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin. So this is a hormone that's coming from the placenta. A lot of pregnancy tests are testing for the presence of this hormone because it only appears during pregnancy. So what's happening here is that the placenta is producing this hormone so that the corpus luteum doesn't die off the way it usually would during a typical menstrual cycle. And that's important because while the placenta is eventually going to take over the production of estrogens and progesterone, it takes a while to be big enough and able to actually do that. We're growing a whole new organ, essentially. So the corpus luteum is going to stick around for 2 months in pregnancy, rather than the 10 days that it usually sticks around in a typical menstrual cycle. And it's going to keep secreting estrogens and progesterone during that time. Okay. So that's how we see this uptick overall in estrogens and progesterone. So we got about 2 months to here. So this is the corpus luteum secreting both the estrogens and progesterone. And we remember that we're counting months since the start of the last menstrual period. So really what we're looking at here is partway through, right? So this first part would be the follicular phase usually. So this would be likely before fertilization occurs. If everything's working exactly the way it does in a textbook, around day 14 is when we had ovulation. So around day 14 is when fertilization likely occurred, because that oocyte that we ovulated is only viable for half a day or a day or so, right? So we actually have a zygote forming somewhere around here. So the typical menstrual cycle is continuing for the second half of the month. But then instead of having that corpus luteum die off like it usually does at the end of the luteal phase, triggering a decrease in progesterone and therefore triggering the start of a menstrual period, that doesn't happen because we have this HCG that's coming from a growing placenta, sustaining that corpus luteum. So you can see at the very end of this month is when we see that HCG coming online and starting to tick up. So instead of seeing the fall we usually see in progesterone, progesterone keeps going up and up, which is why we shouldn't see a menstrual period occurring here. So progesterone is also going to be making sure that we don't ovulate again, right? So we would like to have one egg be fertilized and then have one pregnancy, right? You don't want to have one pregnancy starting, ovulate partway through pregnancy, and then somehow have another baby in there that's a different age. That would be a mess. So it's helpful that progesterone is looping back and turning off that GnRH that was coming from the hypothalamus. And it's turning off both LH and FSH kind of as a result. Those are the hormones that were partially helping our follicles develop, but particularly what we're interested in this pathway, the most important part, is that what triggers ovulation from the ovaries is the LH surge, that spike that we see right before ovulation. So by having all this progesterone around suppressing that, we don't have a signal for LH to surge, which means that we don't have another egg being ovulated here. So our last picture is really just this, but bigger. So if you wanted to take your own notes, right? So this is that first month since the last menstrual period. So during this segment of time, you would have no idea that you're pregnant, and you're not actually for the first half. So those first 2 weeks, this is kind of Schrodinger's pregnancy. Is fertilization going to happen? Is it not? And then if it happens, this is what goes on with the hormones afterwards. Okay, so while we're zoomed in like this, it can be helpful to look a little bit at parturition itself. So parturition is birth, right? So what you'll notice, right, is that progesterone has been suppressing uterine contractions, right, which otherwise estrogen would be stimulating. So if you'll notice right here when birth occurs, right, you can see both estrogen and progesterone drop to basically 0, but progesterone is going a teeny tiny bit before, right? So that dropping level of progesterone right at the end as we're coming up to labor and birth of a baby means that that estrogen can have a little bit more effect. Exactly what kicks off the whole process of birth, at least according to your textbook, is kind of up in the air. Maybe signals coming from the fetus itself and some fetal hormones. But regardless, this is what you'd see in the hormones right there. So after birth, you might also be feeling some effects of that sudden drop in these hormones. So if you, if you hear about people having some emotional issues, things like that after birth, right? Some postpartum emotional issues. This is a massive change in hormonal levels. So that could partially be a little bit related to that. The same way, sometimes there's a little more emotional instability as hormone levels change during normal life, during a normal menstrual cycle, potentially, depending on how you personally react to hormones. So that's our last little bit of content. So I'm going to run through a couple things with you that I've put up. So in addition to your practice tests, so to make sure that you have as many easy points as possible in this class, there is one final quiz. It's only 3 questions. So go ahead and do it sometime before the exam to study the final couple of topics we talked about, mainly on Monday. I've also put up some study materials. So I have these with me on paper if you want to work on them now, but I'm going to explain them while they're up here. Separate out what I'm looking at. Okay. Again, not required, but we're going to watch through it. Should be good. Okay. So last time, I think I gave you a set of study tables that you could use. So one of the things that you see here in this review document is a link to those. I made some for this exam as well. So you have an option to make a copy for yourself. So we've got blank tables. Not sure what my idea was when I was writing you those prompts. You've got what I was thinking about trying to prompt you for. So I pulled out some of the major topics that we went through in this unit. So we've got one on how we're digesting each of the different macromolecules that we're interested in, linking that up to what are the names of some of the polymers, what actually directly gets absorbed across the intestinal wall. Is it an amino acid? Does it have to be a monosaccharide? Can we have larger molecules? Plus which enzymes we're going to need to digest that, plus where those enzymes come from, plus where this process is happening. And the next topic I picked out for you was our phases of control, that's cephalic, gastric, and intestinal phase stimuli. So we got both what that means in terms of what are we sensing, plus what the effects are from that phase when we see those stimuli. What is that doing in your body? What is that helping you produce? Which enzymes are going to be affected? Then we got a table pulling out our different enzymes or classes of enzymes. Saliva isn't directly an enzyme, but can contain enzyme. This is basically that section where we went through stimuli for, are we increasing pepsinogen levels, things like that. So we got broken down by different molecules and substances that we're tracking, what exactly the stimuli would be for us to have more of that, what cells those would be coming from, and what our overall kind of effect is when we see these stimuli and increase this kind of responsiveness. Okay. Finally, I only did one for our reproductive section. What I pulled out for you here, one thing that I could think of putting in table form was that development of the reproductive system. So that part when we talked about chromosomes and the SRY gene and TDF and MIH and testes and ovaries and Müllerian ducts and Wolffian ducts, that's what's in this table. Okay. So we got those. In addition, we got some sort of essay style review questions. They're all lumped together, both GI and reproductive in this section. What I've pulled out on paper, if you want to sit here and try them after I finish yapping at you, I have some of the GI ones pulled out here and then the reproductive ones pulled out there. Otherwise, you have digital copies of these if you want to work on them later. So running through a bunch of this GI stuff, a link to some additional GI practice problems if you want to go through those. Then running through a bunch of reproductive stuff, a link to some more practice questions for reproductive stuff. And then at the end, you have a link to the key for this. So we can talk about it together. You can ask me, but you also have what we're kind of looking for here. Okay. What else did I have for you? Okay. Finally, so we are going to have exam 4 on Friday. So next time I see you, then we'll be moving directly into finals period, which is when your final will be. So like last semester, you'll sit your final, it'll be 16 questions. And then you'll have the option to retake one of our 4 lecture exams. In order to help you make that decision, I think everybody's practicals should be over, right? Okay, so I'll grab your practical grades and make sure that they're all in there in the grade book. And I can give you what the cutoffs in terms of number of points are going to be for each of our kind of grades in the grade book, right? Like what's an A, what's an A minus, and so on, so that you have a direct kind of target to shoot for and kind of know what you need when we get to the final. Since we don't have a review day anymore directly for the final, not that I could talk through an entire semester in an hour anyway, I'm going to pull out what I consider the biggest major topics for each of those exams. And if I see any trends in how people did on past exams, I'll pull out what topics seem to be trickiest for people so that you can kind of touch back on those. So I'll get that up shortly so that you can look at that once you start studying for the final. Any questions for me right now at this moment? Yeah. I'm going to test you based on what I think was most important. So it's going to try to be big picture topics, not tiny little details, but I'm not going to try to either trip you up or like be selecting exact questions from the previous exams. Does that make sense? Yeah, because I know it's a lot to study too. So the most important things that I want you to remember for each of these topics after you leave this class. But I'll list those out for you in an outline. Any questions? So having said I've given you access to this whole review sheet, there is one thing that this question number 9, I think is a decent summary of pulling together some of this reproductive stuff that we've just been talking about. So you can do it yourself, but I do want to walk you through a little bit of this to kind of pull everything together. Okay. So I want you to take a second and either think about or look at these diagrams or pull up the review sheet, thinking about what's going on with our hormones and all our different cell types in the male reproductive system and in the female reproductive system, like during adulthood, because we have some parallels and some differences here. And I want to make sure that we're kind of making these connections because it'll make it easier to remember as you're moving forward into the exam. So I'm going to give you a couple minutes to look at this, and then I'm just going to highlight a couple things that I want you to think about as takeaways. And you can talk to your neighbors about this as well. I found multiple graphs for the female reproductive system, so I'm just going to point out that's that early to mid follicular phase that we're looking at here. I'll pull out a couple of my takeaways here, my pitch to you. Now that we're looking at this stuff together, right? So we saw that in development, we really have kind of parallels happening in the reproductive system as we're developing those tracts, right? We're producing gonads in both. We have a difference in literally physical parallel ducts developing, but we are producing similar structures when it comes to the physical anatomy. We have a similar kind of parallel when we look at what's happening internally, physiologically with the hormones, right? So really, the main differences that we see when it comes to these flow charts tend to be just like the cell types, the cell names involved. When we're thinking about the hormonal levels, at least if we're comparing what's going on in the early parts of the menstrual cycle to the male reproductive system, we see most of it is kind of the same, right? So our goal in each of these is to produce a gamete, right? So we have spermatogenesis and oogenesis that are our goals, right? So we know that in terms of lifespan, that's a little different between males and females. But if we're thinking about the physiology, they can both do it, right? Just with a couple different kind of, is it happening on a monthly level or could this be happening every day? Right? So our goals are kind of the same, to produce a gamete. And we're responding to similar signals, right? So we have these tropic hormones that we're interested in coming from the hypothalamus and its action on the anterior pituitary. And they're tropic because that means we've got like a domino effect, right? So those anterior pituitary hormones also affecting hormones elsewhere in the body, in this case, in our gonads. So in the testes and in the ovaries, right? So we can see that it's the same hormones, right? They've got the same names. So from the hypothalamus, we have our GnRH in both, right? From the anterior pituitary, we're increasing these same two hormones as well. So our FSH and our LH are going to be involved in both systems, and they respond to GnRH in the same way, right? So moving down, right, we can see that FSH is acting on cells in the testes, happens to be our Sertoli cells here, and cells in the ovaries. So they're not acting on the oocytes themselves, they're acting on the surrounding granulosa cells in each of those follicles in the female reproductive system, right? But we've got FSH doing something, and we have the same hormone in each system acting as a negative feedback loop on FSH, right? So both of these are producing inhibin, acting as a negative feedback loop on FSH, right? When we think about the other side, when we're thinking about LH, right, we can see that in the LH pathway, we have a little bit of a kind of short stop situation or stopover of some kind. I don't know how you want to think of it, right? But we're interacting with a kind of helper cell. I like to think of them, at least in the context of this pathway, right? So LH is acting on Leydig cells here as an intermediary before it acts on Sertoli cells that do the actual spermatogenesis. In our females, we've got the theca cells acting here as our intermediary before we get to the granulosa cells, right? But these pathways are pretty much the same other than our exact cell types. In females, we can even see that we have androgens, so typically male hormones, being produced in response to LH, but we do a fun trick and convert them into estrogen, which we don't do in the males. So that would be a difference. So when you're trying to think about what the effects are of each of these hormones and the kind of signaling pathways, if you can remember one of them easily or more easy or easier than the other, it can be helpful to kind of think about the corollary in the opposite system, that kind of homologous structure, because for the most part, we see the same kinds of actions and reactions, just with a little bit of a twist in each of these systems. That's what I wanted to point out to you here. Okay. So that is it for what I have planned to tell you. So if you want to grab these pieces of paper and work on these with a pen and paper, you can do that. If you want to work on these in pairs on your computers, you can do that. If you want to go study in the library, you can do that. General study time right now, and a good time to ask questions and clarifications, and I can talk to you individually and specifically about some of these concepts.